There has no doubt been a huge resurgence of portable wood stoves for camping the last couple of years. It's no surprise considering the new focus in the last 2 years on prepping, survivalism, and camping. There's no denying the alluring effect of a hot crackling stove and a cozy tent on a cold winter day. Mrs. Catnip and I have become surprisingly dependent on the wood stove, even on rainy summer days. Hello! So, after 2 crazy months of summer, we're back and we're finally able to put some more videos together for you. So we've been getting a lot of questions about this stove. This is the one we use in our tent, and today I'm going to tell you about it. It's a home built. We didn't buy this one, we made it. It's really tough to find exactly what we were looking for. I don't think it exists, so we ended up building our own. The skill testing question today is, what does the stove have in common with our bird fountain? We'll get back to that in a bit. So a few years ago, I wanted to acquire a stove that had a lot of good features for survival. So something that was portable, lightweight, you could dismantle it, big enough to heat a shelter in cold Canadian winters. And there were some nice stoves out there, a couple of them, a couple of choices, but they were ridiculously expensive. They weren't quite big enough, and so I ended up making my own. Then I made another one, and then I made another one, and then I made this one. So this is kind of an evolution in progress, and it's probably not the very final version. There's a couple little mods I might do to this someday, but it's really close. It's a really great stove. It's a monster. It heats things like crazy. It burns through the night, and this is something anybody at home can build because I used fairly regular tools that most people have or can get very inexpensively, and I used regular parts, and I didn't weld anything because I'm not a welder, and if I was, I probably wouldn't be a very good one. So here we go. I'm going to tell you all about it. Okay, so the body of the stove is just a flat piece of stainless steel, and we got that from the local metal retailer, I guess it would be. And all we did was roll it into a cylinder, and then we bolted it together. I don't know how easy it is to see those now that they're painted. So those are stainless steel M3 nut and bolts. I just got a cheap stainless steel set off of Amazon. Comes with nuts and bolts of different lengths. Probably could go a little bit bigger. We're trying to be pretty light with this, and I use these for other small projects, so I went with a fairly small bolt. But there's more risk of stripping them and whatnot if you're taking them apart. Lots. Definitely go with stainless steel because after the stove has been fired and it reaches high temps and whatnot, if you use regular bolts, they'll corrode and they'll be really difficult to undo. But I've undone these ones to make little changes many times, and they've held out really well, and they're very easy to get undone. They don't corrode and jam up at all. So that's all that is, and that I think is 24 gauge, and we use 24 thousandths of an inch thick, and we bought that because it was the thinnest regular stock I could get from the store. And I would have liked to have actually gone a little bit thinner. Maybe it would have been a slightly lighter stove, and it certainly would have been easier to form into a cylinder, but it was just a bit of a challenge. It wasn't too hard, really. The door of the stove I made out of 30 thou. I just got a little thicker just because I wanted it to be a little more stable, a little more rigid, and so we used 30 thou, but you could probably get away with 24 thou for that as well. And all of our holes here, this is cut with a Dremel tool. It's very difficult to cut stainless steel with a handsaw of any type, so I just bought like 100 cheap for, like, I don't know, it's $12 or something for 100 cheap discs for the Dremel tool. It's just diamond wheel cutting discs, and cut that out. And all of my circular holes are cut with the Dremel tool as well, and then just cleaned up with a file or a bit of sanding. It's very difficult to drill large holes in thin stainless steel like this one, so If you're careful, you get a near perfect circle out of it, and it doesn't have to be too critical for a wood stove. The hinge is just regular, I guess they call it piano hinge from the hardware store. We used brass on the last one, and the brass actually melted and the door fell off. Brass is definitely not the material to be using on a wood stove, so make sure, there's lots of different choices when you go to the hardware store. Make sure it's a metal that can handle, you know, 700 or 800 degrees Celsius. Yeah, we got this piece of tubing. I don't know how long it is anymore. It looks to be about 2.5 to 3 inches long. Also from the metal retailer in town, and I just bought something that was approximately the size I wanted. It's not too critical for this. This is their whole intake. And then inside, hopefully you can see that. I'll show you a detail view later maybe. Oh, it's not too bad. See it there? That's just a pizza cutter wheel from the dollar store. Stainless steel pizza cutter. Okay. Thanks for showing up, helping with the video. And then the axle for that, the shaft for that, is just a piece of heavy galvanized wire. We'll talk about galvanized metals with wood stoves in a bit here. You can't use galvanized metal for lots of parts of the stove, but for this you can, just because there's not too much heat in this part, and it's such a small amount of metal that it won't matter anyway. The issue is toxicity, so we'll talk about that in a bit when we get to other parts of the stove. And then I just drilled a hole in a bolt going through the metal disc in there, and when you put the shaft through the bolt hole that I drilled, and then put, hard to see there, there's a wing nut on the other side. There you can see it. When you tighten it all up together, it just holds the disc in the right spot on the shaft. And then just a hole there, and a hole down here, and then I put a little spring, just a random spring I found from somewhere. Got a whole box of random springs, and that just keeps a little tension on it so it sits in the spot you leave it. So that was easy. This is how we... Really? Is there anything good in there? You gonna go right in? Might as well. Promo picture, thumbnail. Thank you. You're still a good model, even though you're like 1,000,000 years old. That's right. Okay, the way that we mounted the air intake to the door was we just used a couple of sort of home hardware L brackets, and just, got to tighten that up again, and just mounted it on the back side there so it looked better. Could have been on the front, but wanted all that sort of hardware in the back. This screen is also from dollar store products. It's just a stainless steel strainer that we robbed the screen off of. And then the latch, oh yeah, we're getting to that. So the handle and latch is just some snare wire, stainless steel snare wire, fairly thick stuff so that it remains fairly rigid. And then I just put a bolt and extended it out from the inside there on the main body, and that just clips on there, and there's no way for that to come loose. And this is kind of nice because it actually pulls the door and forms it fairly tight around here, tightens it up, and you can just change where this little bend in there is and change the tension on it. So that works really well. It's kind of a go-to. We've had that on a number of stoves now and works really well. And then this is just an aluminum spacer that we tossed on there just to make it cooler to hang on to. It doesn't get hot because it's not very well coupled to the stainless steel there. And that works really, really well. So there's the door. That's probably the most complicated part of the whole process, was getting that made. And again, we just used just traced that out and then used the Dremel tool to cut that open. I guess I should mention these 3 holes here align with the 3 nuts and bolts that I used for attaching the hinge to the door. And it's just so that when the door closes, it's flush. It ends up flush with the metal here. There's a little spot for these nuts and bolts to recess into. Oh, another thing I should mention is that the curve of this door was just done by hand. As soon as I cut out the basic shape, I just bent it with my hands. It's not that hard to flex, and it pretty much stays where you want it to stay. And I just kind of experimented bending it until it matched the same curve as the body of the stove. And in fact, one thing you might notice about this door, and it's a fairly important thing to bring up, is that it is very undersized for this stove. And the reason for that is because it was originally made for this much smaller stove that is actually made out of an upside down canning pot. Stainless steel canning pot. They work fantastic. Real cheap, pre-made body for a wood stove, small wood stove, and only weighs, gee, probably 1.5 pounds or something like that. Anyway, and this is also the stove that we used the brass on and ended up melting the hinges off of. So anyway, the problem with a small door on here is actually there's two problems. The first problem is that it's very hard to stack wood inside here when it's burning and get things right to the top. So eventually, I don't know, I'm going to do something. I'm going to put a bigger door on. And the other problem, bigger problem, is that if you can't stack things in here and it's burning and you've got a bunch of convoluted structure in there and you go to put another one in and you squeeze it in and it doesn't quite go all the way in and you got a little lip of the wood sticking out here. If you can't close this door properly because of that, this stove can get really out of control. Enough air gets through the seam of the door, you can't close the valve and totally shut down the air in here. There'll be so much suction from the flame and the heat going up the chimney that it'll just keep feeding the fire very ferociously if you can't get that door closed. So what happens is it gets kind of out of control and it's so hot you can't even get near the stove. And I can see a situation where it gets so hot for so long that you could end up damaging the tent. You could scorch the ceiling of the tent with it. So you have to be real careful when you're stacking wood into this small aperture here, that you get everything in there and you don't put too big of a piece in that you can't close the door completely. Because if you just about get it in and it starts burning and you're in a tent, what are you going to do with that burning stick? You take it out. You have to have tongs, and we always use just cheap kitchen tongs, whatnot, so we can grab the wood and not have to grab it with our bare hands. Pull it out, and then what do? You're in a tent with an on-fire piece of wood, and it's just going to smoke everything up and whatnot. So it's a situation we've come close to having a problem with, and it's mainly because of just having such a small door that you can't really organize things in here as well as you'd like to. So that's a future mod, is just building a proper sized door for this. I just kind of got lazy and we weren't using this stove much, so I took the door off of it and put it on here. And this isn't even the original door for this. The original door for this one, I'll show it to you. So this is the original door for the smaller stove here. And it was a great door. The only problem with it was that you couldn't turn it down. We didn't turn it down on this stove much because the stove is not painted, so it didn't put out much heat, and so it always ran through the wood pretty quickly. But even if you wanted to close it down, you really couldn't, because there's no way to adjust these holes here. So that's why we ended up building this one. This stove, by the way, is 7 times the volume, internal volume of this stove, even though it's not physically much of a bigger circumference. That's what it works out to. Makes quite a difference just going up in size a little bit. So, the top and bottom of the stove. The top and the bottom of the stove are $4 platters from Dollarama, stainless steel serving platters, and that is why I mentioned our water fountain. So we've actually got two of those here too. One's mounted permanently to the log here, and the other one we use on top of it just to take out, to clean. It's just easier if it's not attached to the log. So that's what's on the top and the bottom of the stove, and this needs to be cleaned, so I'll just with one hand hopefully take this out and dump it out, and so I can show you what it is. It still has the sticker on the bottom. Oh, it does. I don't know if you can see that sticker very well, but we use these for all kinds of things. They're very handy. Birds are gonna have to wait till after I'm done filming this video to get their water back. So that is on the top here and the bottom here, and this is a little bit thinner than the body, so it's lighter too. And then all we did to attach it was I'll show you more detail of it in a bit here, but we just have a bolt here and a bolt here, and there's a piece of metal behind that. You can think of it as just a rectangular piece of metal. And what I did was I drilled the holes in the metal that's back there a little bit closer together than need be, so that when you cinch this together, when you tighten it up, it pulls these two pieces together tightly. And we tried to do this without any kind of seal in between, but it just allows too much air in, and this thing's a monster. Once it really gets going, it's just crazy, and you're like, oh, I can't shut it down because there's too much air and it gets too hot in the tent. So I bought this stuff, and this is basically just the same seal that you see around the doors of stoves. It's just a replacement one, except for this one's a little bit different. It's made out of some kind of carbon fiber instead of fiberglass, and I wanted to try that just because the fiberglass stuff sheds a little bit and can be a bit itchy, and I haven't found that with this so far, so hopefully that solves that problem. And I'll probably, it was kind of a tester to try it on the top, and I'll probably try it on the bottom here eventually too. And that's the beauty of the stove, is that you can just take it apart anytime you want and modify things and change things and add things, and it's awesome. So I just grabbed a flashlight and I want to show you a little bit more detail with the inside of the stove here. Let's see. So there's the metal bracket holding the platters, top and bottom platters, to the body of the stove. You can see I just have just a scrap piece of metal basically, and then drilled some holes and poked the nuts and bolts through. And then on the body, to make it line up with the middle of this lip here, I just used some washers in between them just to space it properly and give it the right tension. What I have here, this is just some random tubing. I think it was from a standing living room lamp sort of thing, and I threw out the lamp, but I saved the nice chromed aluminum pieces, and they're just hollow. But I have ready rod, threaded rod going through there, and I've got a wing nut on the bottom, which I'll show you, and then just a nut on the top. And these were pretty long at first, but we found that with them being pretty long, we didn't need it to be that long. I made them long so that it would stay cooler down here, but this actually stays very cool, almost room temperature, even though the stove is this close to the bottom, and there's for a couple of reasons. One, you'll notice that I've painted the whole stove black, but I haven't painted this bottom one black. That's just discolored from the heat, and so it has a very low emissivity, and I'll talk about that in a bit because I'll talk about painting the whole stove. But anyway, just remember that this part is not painted, the rest of the stove is, and that keeps things cooler here. And then the ready rod, let's see here, there's enough sunlight, I think, goes right through all of that, and that way we can take this apart when we're traveling, so we don't have to have this base on it. So there's the wing nuts on the bottom. I just undo those, and all of this just comes apart. This is these are aluminum Costco serving platters, and I think they were like $8 each, and I've got two, and they're back to back just to put a thermal gap between the floor and the stove, and that works really well. It's super stable. And the other good thing about this is that if you don't have the stove on and it's raining, the wasps are in overtime in the yard today for some reason. Yeah, if it's raining and the stove is off, this will catch the few drops of water and whatnot that managed to come down and not evaporate. So you can see this is all made out of just off-the-shelf common parts that you can get, and very inexpensive. And I think the most expensive part of this was the actual body metal and door metal. So these three pieces of metal cost, just because we kind of bought them when we had to from a retailer instead of sourcing them, researching and sourcing them properly. I think we paid about $7 metric dollars for those. 70 metric dollars. This hole is drilled with a Dremel tool, just with cutting wheels. So I undersize, traced it, cut it, and then just kind of grind it to the right size and shape after. I'll get into this coupler here in a minute. So one of the hardest things to source for this build and for any stove build is chimney materials, especially when you're doing something portable. You don't want the dual wall insulated pipe that is code rated for homes and costs like $100 a section. You want something that packs up tight, is inexpensive, it's light, and an appropriate size too. So what this is, or what it was actually, was galvanized, really small, like 4-inch metal ducting for furnace ductwork at home. And before I did this project, actually, I didn't even realize that there was 4-inch stuff available. And it's great because it's like, I think this was like $3 or $4 a section, very inexpensive. The problem with galvanized materials is that when they heat up to stove-like temperatures, they become toxic. And it's very difficult to find any type of pipe. I've looked high and low for something that was in this size category that wasn't galvanized. And it's basically impossible to find, at least for any reasonable cost. So there is a solution though. And it's a great solution. You can actually get rid of the galvanized coating on this, and there's a couple of ways to do that. One is through extreme heat. The other is through soaking it in acid. And that sounds complicated and dangerous, but it's not, because the acid you want to use for this is regular old vinegar, 5% grocery store grade vinegar. So what we did with this, galvanizing, by the way, is only on the outside. It doesn't permeate through the entire metal. So what we did was we put a couple of pieces in the vinegar for a couple of days, and then there was just a couple of thick spots left that I decided to sand off, but really we didn't need to because it gets hot enough that it burns off anyway. And so what I did after that was I put the stove outside, and I installed the stove pipes, and I got the stove as hot as I possibly could, and you can actually see it burning off right away. And I'll show you a couple of interesting things like this here in a minute where the galvanizing is still on, and I'll show you why that is. So you'll notice here one is a different color than the other two. This is what it looks like when there's no galvanizing left on the pipes. This one we actually painted black, and this is the first piece that goes onto the stove. Oh, and this piece here is just another piece, and we didn't even bother taking the galvanizing off because it just gets so hot, and it's actually inside the whole exhaust section. So any galvanization that came off at the beginning went just up the pipe and outside. So we didn't have to do it on that part. But all this is really is just a small section of this, about maybe this long, cut it off, and then I just put slits in around that piece and folded it out underneath here. And then this ridge here is larger than this hole, and so it doesn't allow it to get pushed in. It's good and solid. And you can actually just undo this and take this out, push it through the other side because it's flared out on the inside. Maybe I'll show you that with the flashlight. You can see it right there. So that was super easy to accomplish. Makes an easy coupling. And then actually you can see here, this pipe is a little shorter than this pipe, and that's because that section is missing there, and that is actually literally the section we used on the stove over there. So here's kind of an interesting thing. You can see where the galvanizing has been removed by the high temperatures of the exhaust here on the stovepipe, but it hasn't been removed here. And that's because what's happening is, as hot gases are drafting up the pipe, it's sucking in outside air into just basically the gaps here where the seam and the junction meet, and that cool air is cooling the outside of the stovepipe here, and it's not hot enough to burn away the galvanizing. So it's really easy to tell the difference between the two here. Here it is again on the next piece up, and it's actually a bigger area of galvanization still left on there because of course it's the pipe has cooled a lot now. The exhaust has cooled a lot going up the pipe to the outside world here, but we don't care about this part because it's well outside the tent. Up here you can see where it's mixing with the ambient air, and it's much cooler, and the galvanizing isn't coming off at all up at the very last piece there. So how this works, just put this piece on here first. You can do this with one hand. There we go. And that's the first piece. Then use the long one. Oh, and so you want to protect the stove jack, which is the piece of the tent that the chimney goes through. You want to protect that from excessive heat, and the stove jack is meant to take a lot of heat, but it can't take direct heat from a chimney that is this hot. So what I do is I just shove this on over. It's just a pressure fit, and this is from Walmart. This is two I don't know what you would call them, like the cooking utensil holders, I guess, that go on a countertop, and they're just back to back, one on top of the other, one's upside down. Just a quick side note, do you recognize these holes? Tell ya, Walmart's got some good go-to standard parts for wood stoves. So yeah, the reason these cutlery holders are such a great deal is because they're stainless steel and they're already formed into a cylinder, and with some circulation holes to boot. So this is the base. This would have been the base on the top one, and I just again took the Dremel tool and cut out a hole that was a little bit smaller than the pipe, and then I folded the lip of it in just so it would create sort of a spring tension against the pipe here. So I can't do this with one hand. Let's see what I can do here. Take that. Get that to go in there. most annoying sound ever. Oh, that drives me nuts. So that is actually the piece that goes through the tent. So, again, fighting with one hand here. Okay, so this is usually supported by the tent, so wouldn't be at that angle typically, but it'll do for now. So, yeah, the other really nice thing about the galvanized furnace ducting for $3 or $4 a section is that it comes with these flange sections that help it go together really well. Okay, I want to explain why this is black and this isn't. If you're ever making your own stove, make sure you paint it black. Don't leave it bare stainless. The reason for that is that bare shiny metals have a really low emissivity. What that means is that they do not emit heat very well, and they do not absorb heat very well. They reflect heat. Paint, on the other hand, and probably particularly black paint, but probably doesn't even have to be black paint as long as it's high temperature paint, has a very high emissivity, which means it absorbs heat and it emits heat readily. So what I've done here is I've painted both the inside and the outside of the stove. Paint, because it has a high emissivity, it absorbs the thermal radiation from the fire, and because it's directly coupled to the metal, it readily transfers that thermal energy into the metal, and the metal very efficiently conducts or transfers that heat to the outside surface paint, and because that paint has a high emissivity, it radiates that heat very well, that thermal radiation out into the environment. If you didn't have that going on, most of the heat that the fire generates, most of the thermal energy, would be reflected off of the inside and back into the particles of material that's burning and straight up the chimney as those particles leave the fire as smoke, and all your heat goes out the chimney. So a really cool thing to do then is to paint the lower part of your chimney. You don't need to worry about the upper part, and you want to keep this part relatively low emissivity. So you want this to still just be a bare metal. And what that does is this gets really hot, and you can actually feel it. Like when this is running, you put your hand here, and it just about wants to cook your hand. You put it right here, and it feels like room temperature again. It's amazing. So that protects the tent itself as the heat's going through the chimney. And then this part is just added radiation bonus into the room. So that's what I've done here. So, and then the upper part doesn't matter. You don't need to paint it because it's outside and it doesn't matter what temperature it's at. So just a quick word about high temperature paint for stoves. This is what I used. And the reason I used flat, besides the look of it, I actually like the look of the flat, but the glossy stuff has a much lower temperature rating. This is 650 degrees Celsius, and I think the glossy was around 500 and some, if I remember correctly. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly, but definitely not hot enough for the stove. And in fact, I can tell that even this stuff, when I get the stove really hot, it changes its character a little bit. It looks different. It looks like it's been stressed, but it holds up, and it's good enough. Another nice thing about the chimney here is that it collapses and you can shove it into itself, so you just have one, what is that, about a 3-foot length that you can travel with, which is really nice. And I guess if you wanted to be fancy about it, you could use a bunch of smaller sections that actually fit inside the stove, but it really doesn't take up much room. We fill the stove with all our other stuff. We put a bag in it, and then we throw our boots and hatchet and whatever else. We stuff tons and tons of stuff in there, and so it doesn't really take up that much room in the car. I think what I'll do is I'll just show you the unassembled sections there, the way we travel with it, and we'll go from there. So, chimney with the thermal spacer, protective spacer. Oh, 4 pounds, 3.86. You see that? Chimney itself is 9.45, 9.5 pounds basically. $6.34. Anyhow, that's it, I think. Again, if you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll try and get back to them as soon as I can. And hope you got something out of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. And please subscribe if you did, so we can do lots more great videos for you. Have a great one. I was just cleaning it. Could have waited till I had it cleaned. You could have. There you go. That's all I got. I gotta go turn the tap on. You're cute. Yeah, you gonna have some water? It's fresh water. Okay, I'll leave you alone. Let me get in there and get some. Hold on. Need something to stand on? There you go. Yeah, you can reach that, I think. Can't you? There you go.